They thought the biggest decision left was choosing a wedding date. They thought the family had finally accepted the future, the promises had been made, and nothing could stand between this person and the life they wanted to build with you. But one envelope changed everything. One DNA result entered that house, and within minutes, the celebration turned into complete silence. Someone in that family knew this truth could destroy years of secrets. And when the person who wants to marry you finally read the last line, they looked across the room and asked one terrifying question: who knew about this before me? Listen carefully, because what happened next wasn't simply about DNA. It was about betrayal, hidden decisions, and a secret that may explain why certain people have been trying so hard to control this relationship from the beginning. The person who wants to marry you never expected this test to reveal anything serious. It wasn't even supposed to become a family issue. At first, they believed it would confirm something simple, settle an old question, and allow everyone to move forward. Instead, the result exposed a connection nobody had prepared them to see. They read the page once, then again, then a third time, slowly, as though the words might somehow rearrange themselves. Their hands began trembling. Their face changed. Someone sitting nearby immediately noticed and asked what was wrong, but they couldn't answer. Their eyes were fixed on one section of the report. A relationship they had believed their entire life suddenly didn't appear to be what they had been told. And that was when the room became uncomfortable. One family member stood up too quickly. Another avoided eye contact. Someone whispered that maybe the laboratory had made a mistake. But instead of calming the situation, those reactions made everything worse. Because the person who wants to marry you noticed something, nobody seemed completely surprised. That realization hurt more than the DNA result itself. They slowly placed the paper on the table and said, "Why does everyone look like they already knew?" Nobody answered. The silence became unbearable. For years, this family had carried a story about who belonged where, who should marry whom, which relationships were acceptable, and which people should be kept at a distance. And suddenly, the foundation underneath all those decisions was cracking. The same people who had spoken with confidence about tradition, family reputation, bloodline, loyalty, and responsibility were now struggling to explain why an important truth had been hidden. Then your name came into the conversation. Not because you had anything to do with the DNA result itself, but because the person who wants to marry you suddenly remembered every warning they had received about your relationship. Every time someone had said, "This marriage isn't right." Every time a family member had tried to delay things. Every mysterious argument. Every uncomfortable meeting. Every moment when somebody seemed determined to make them question you. And suddenly they began wondering whether those objections had ever really been about you. What were you afraid I would find out after marrying them? They asked. That question changed the atmosphere instantly. Someone started crying. Another person became angry and said this wasn't the time to bring you into the situation. But the person who wants to marry you refused to back down. They had spent too long accepting explanations that never completely made sense. Now, for the first time, they could see that pieces of their past might be connected. The DNA result wasn't destroying their feelings for you. It was destroying the story their family had built around them. And strangely, the more shocking the truth became, the more certain they became about you. Because they realized something powerful: you were one of the few people who had never tried to control them with secrets. While others had made choices behind closed doors, you had wanted honesty. While others had worried about appearances, you had cared about what was real. While others had tried to decide what their future should look like, you had simply wanted them to choose from their heart. Then an older family member finally spoke. Their voice was shaking. "There's something else you need to know." Everyone turned toward them. The person holding the DNA report froze. "What else?" The older relative looked directly at them and said, "That test didn't uncover the whole secret." Those words landed like thunder. Because suddenly this wasn't one hidden truth. There was another. The relative admitted that years ago, before you were ever seriously discussed as someone they might marry, an agreement had been made inside the family. Certain information had been kept from them intentionally. And when their relationship with you became serious, the family panicked because marriage would eventually force questions nobody wanted answered. Their heartbeat accelerated. "So all those attempts to keep us apart." The relative lowered their eyes. Nobody needed to finish the sentence. The person who wants to marry you stood up, walked away from the table, and stared out the window for several seconds. They weren't thinking about canceling the marriage. They were thinking about how close they had come to losing you because of a secret that had never belonged to either of you. Then they turned around and said something nobody expected. "I'm done letting this family decide who I love." Someone tried to interrupt. They raised their hand. "No. You've had years to talk. Now I'm going to hear the truth." And then they picked up their phone. They opened your contact. Their finger hovered over your name. But before they could call you, the same relative stopped them and whispered, "Before you contact them, you need to see the second document." Because their name is already inside it, the phone remained in their hand, but they didn't press your name. Not yet. Because the moment that older relative said, "Their name is already inside the second document," everything inside them shifted. This was no longer just about a DNA result. This was no longer just about a family secret from years ago. Somehow, you had been connected to this truth long before anyone ever told you. They turned around slowly and asked, "What do you mean their name is inside it?" Nobody answered immediately. The older relative walked toward a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. Their hands were shaking so badly that it took several attempts to open it. Everyone watched in complete silence. Even the family members who had been arguing moments earlier suddenly stopped speaking. Then a thin brown envelope was pulled out. It looked old. The corners were worn. There was handwriting across the front. And when the person who wants to marry you saw the date written there, their face changed completely. That document had existed long before anyone admitted there was a problem. Long before the recent arguments. Long before the marriage conversation became serious. And possibly long before you ever understood why certain people seemed uncomfortable whenever your name was mentioned. The envelope was placed on the table. "Open it," they said. The older relative hesitated. "Open it." This time, their voice shook the entire room. The envelope was opened. Inside were several pages, an old photograph, and a handwritten note that appeared to have been folded and unfolded many times. The first page contained family information. The second contained names and dates. But the third page made them stop breathing for a second. Your full name was there. Not scribbled recently. Not added as an afterthought. It had been written years earlier. They stared at it and whispered, "How is this possible?" One family member immediately tried to leave the room. That was the moment everything became even more suspicious. "Where are you going?" The person froze near the doorway. "I don't want to be part of this." "You already are part of this." Their voice had changed now. The shock was becoming anger. They looked back at the document. Next to your name was another name they recognized immediately. Someone who had been deeply involved in family decisions for years. Someone who had always acted protective. Someone who had repeatedly warned them that marrying you would create problems. And underneath those two names was one sentence that made their stomach drop. If these two families reconnect, the truth cannot remain hidden. They read it again. Then again. Reconnect? That word bothered them. Because reconnect meant there had been a connection before. Something nobody had ever explained. They turned toward the older relative. What happened between these families? Tears began forming in the relative's eyes. It started before you were old enough to understand. Then explain it now. The relative sat down slowly. Years ago, two families had been connected through a situation involving inheritance, identity, and a promise that was never supposed to become public. At the center of that situation was the same family line now mentioned in the DNA report. The shocking result had revealed that someone's biological connection was not what everyone had believed. But that was only the surface. The deeper secret involved why certain records had been changed, why contact between two sides of the family had suddenly ended, and why your name had later become something they feared. The person who wants to marry you stared at everyone. So when I started getting closer to them, you already knew this could come back. No one denied it. That silence was the confession. They stood there devastated. Not because they had stopped loving you, but because they finally understood how much manipulation had surrounded the relationship. Every strange warning. Every unexplained delay. Every time someone had said they were only trying to protect the family. Every attempt to create doubt between you. Every conversation where you were blamed without being allowed to defend yourself. It had all been connected to something much older. Then they picked up the handwritten note. The handwriting belonged to someone who was no longer alive. The first few lines were emotional. They spoke about regret, about keeping a promise too long, about watching innocent people suffer because adults had chosen silence over honesty. Then came the sentence that changed everything. One day, someone from this family may fall in love with someone from theirs. If that happens, do not separate them because of what we did. Their eyes filled with tears. The room became completely still. Because that sentence described exactly what had happened. Two people had found each other. You and them. And instead of allowing the truth to come forward, the family had tried to repeat the same mistake. The person who wants to marry you covered their mouth. For the first time, they understood something that had never made sense. Why the connection with you had always felt strangely familiar. Why being around you felt different from every relationship before. Why losing contact with you had hurt more deeply than anyone around them understood. And why certain people had reacted so strongly when marriage became a possibility. They looked at the family and said, "You knew there was history between us." Nobody answered. You knew. One person finally whispered, "We knew enough to be afraid." Afraid of what? Of what would happen if you started asking questions. That answer broke something inside them. They slammed the document onto the table. You almost destroyed my future because you were afraid of questions. Their voice cracked. You let me doubt the person I love. You let me believe they were the problem. You let them carry blame for something they didn't even know existed. Nobody could look them in the eye. Then they picked up their phone again. This time, they were determined to call you. But before they could, another family member suddenly said, "You still don't understand what the DNA result means." They stopped. What else could it possibly mean? The family member pointed toward the report. Look at the percentage again. They looked down. Their eyes moved across the numbers. And then their entire expression changed. Because the result didn't just expose a hidden biological connection. It suggested that someone they had trusted their entire life had been lying about who they really were. Their voice dropped to a whisper. Who is this person? The older relative began crying harder. And then someone from the back of the room finally said the one sentence nobody had expected to hear. Before you marry you, there is one person you need to meet. Because they have been waiting years to tell you why your two lives were never supposed to cross again, the room went completely silent. The person who wants to marry you slowly lowered the DNA report and stared at the family member who had just spoken. Waiting years? Their voice was barely above a whisper. Who has been waiting for me? Nobody wanted to answer. And that hesitation told them everything they needed to know. There was still more. Much more. The older relative finally wiped their tears and said, there is someone who knew the truth before any of us were willing to admit it. Someone who tried to stop what happened years ago. But nobody listened. Where are they? A long silence followed. Then an address was written on the back of the old envelope. The person who wants to marry you looked at it carefully. They recognized the area. And that recognition made their heart pound harder. Because it was dangerously close to a place you had once mentioned. A place connected to your own family history. They looked up sharply. Does you know this person? The relative shook their head. Maybe not personally. But there is a reason your name appeared in those records. That was enough. They grabbed their keys, the DNA report, the second document, and the handwritten note. One family member tried to stop them. Don't go there tonight. They turned around. You've spent years telling me what not to do. Look where that got us. Nobody moved. I'm going. Then they added something that hit the entire room hard. And after I hear the truth, I'm going directly to you. The drive felt endless. Every red light made them more impatient. Every sentence from the handwritten note replayed in their mind. Do not separate them. Do not repeat our mistake. The words had become impossible to ignore. For years, they had believed the obstacles between you were ordinary family disagreements. Now they understood those obstacles had been built intentionally. And that realization created a painful question. How many moments with you had been stolen? How many conversations had been poisoned? How many times had you gone home believing you weren't enough when the real problem had never been you? Their eyes filled with tears as they gripped the steering wheel. You deserved the truth, they whispered. And I should have fought harder for us. When they finally reached the address, they stopped outside an old house. One light was on. Nothing about the place looked dramatic. But something about it felt heavy. They stepped out of the car carrying the envelope. Before they could even knock, the door opened. An elderly person stood there. The moment they saw the face standing outside, their expression collapsed. They whispered a name. Not yours. Not the name of the person standing there. A different name. Someone from the past. The person holding the DNA report froze. Who did you just call me? The elderly stranger covered their mouth. Tears immediately filled their eyes. You look exactly like them. Like who? The stranger stepped aside. Come inside. They entered cautiously. The house was filled with old photographs. Family photographs. Wedding photographs. Pictures of people they didn't recognize. Then they saw one photograph sitting on a small table. Their body went cold. The person in that picture looked disturbingly familiar. Same eyes. Same expression. Even the same shape of the face. They picked up the photograph with shaking hands. Who is this? The elderly stranger sat down. That is the reason the DNA results shocked your family. The room seemed to disappear around them. What does that mean? The stranger looked directly into their eyes. It means the story you were told about your family was incomplete. They pulled out another folder. This one was thicker than the envelope at home. Inside were hospital records, letters, old legal documents, and photographs. Some of the pages carried signatures from people the person recognized. Family members who had claimed they knew nothing. That betrayal cut deep. You're telling me they signed these? Yes. And then lied to me? For years. Their breathing became uneven. Then they noticed another document. Your family name appeared on it. They pulled it forward immediately. Why is their family mentioned here? The elderly stranger closed their eyes for a moment. Because years ago, someone from your family and someone from theirs tried to expose what had happened. The person who wants to marry you stared in disbelief. They knew each other very well. How well? The stranger hesitated, and then answered, well enough that your families were never strangers. That sentence changed everything. The person sat down slowly. Their mind was racing. Every strange coincidence between you. Every uncomfortable reaction from certain relatives. Every warning. Every unexplained hostility. It suddenly felt like the relationship had walked into the middle of a story that began long before either of you understood it. But there was something even more painful. The elderly stranger pulled out one final letter. This was supposed to be delivered years ago. To whom? To someone in your family. Why wasn't it? Because it disappeared before it could reach them. The person unfolded it. The first paragraph described a decision made under pressure. The second described fear. The third described how innocent people would one day pay for that decision if the truth remained hidden. And then they reached a line mentioning you. Not only your family. You. Their hands began trembling. How could they have written about you years ago? The stranger answered carefully. Because that name wasn't added years ago. The person looked confused. What? The original letter ended before that section. A chill moved through them. Then who added this? The stranger stared at the writing. Someone who found this letter after you and you became close. The person stood up. So someone has been tracking our relationship? The stranger nodded slowly. Someone was terrified that the two of you would uncover the old connection. Anger replaced shock. Who? The stranger reached into the folder and removed a small photograph. They turned it over. A name was written on the back. The moment the person read it, their face lost all color. They knew that name. They had trusted that person. They had listened to their advice. They had even allowed that person to influence decisions about you. No. The elderly stranger said nothing. This can't be true. But underneath the photograph was proof. Messages. Dates. Signatures. Evidence that this person had been communicating with several members of the family while pretending to be completely neutral. The person who wants to marry you felt tears streaming down their face. They were the one telling me to walk away from you. The stranger nodded. And they had a reason. What reason? Because if you married you, certain family records could become impossible to hide. The person clenched the photograph in their hand. This wasn't protection. It wasn't concern. It wasn't tradition. Someone had been actively working against your future together. And suddenly, all the guilt they had placed on you began turning into regret. They pulled out their phone. This time, there would be no delay. No family member was going to stop them. No secret was going to silence them. They opened your contact and prepared to call. But before they pressed the button, the elderly stranger said, "Wait." They turned. "What now?" "There's something you need to hear too." The stranger walked toward an old cabinet and removed a small recording device. This was recorded the night everything went wrong years ago. The person stared at it. "Who is speaking on it?" The stranger's eyes filled with sadness. "Three people." They pressed play. At first there was static. Then voices. One voice belonged to someone from the person's family. Another voice belonged to someone connected to yours. And the third voice. The person suddenly stopped breathing. They recognized it immediately. It belonged to the same person who had spent years warning them to stay away from you. The recording continued. And then one sentence came through clearly. "If those two ever choose each other, we lose control of everything." The person's eyes filled with rage. They whispered, "So this was never about protecting me." The elderly stranger shook their head. "No." The person looked down at your name glowing on the phone screen. Then another sentence played from the recording. A sentence so shocking that they immediately stopped the audio. Their hands were trembling. What did they just say? The stranger looked devastated. "You heard it correctly." The person pressed play again. And this time the words were unmistakable. "Make sure you never finds out who really asked for the separation." The recording stopped, but the truth had already shattered every excuse the family had used for years. The person who wants to marry you stood completely still, staring at your name on the phone screen while one painful realization settled into their heart: you had never been the reason the relationship became difficult. Someone else had created the distance. Someone else had planted the doubts. Someone else had used the family secret, and the truth behind that DNA result, to keep the two of you from getting close enough to uncover everything. They immediately called you. When your voice came through, they couldn't speak for several seconds. Then they finally whispered, "I owe you the truth." You could hear the emotion in their voice. I found out why they were so afraid of us getting married. There was silence on the other end. They weren't afraid of you. They were afraid of what our marriage would expose. Their voice broke. And I'm sorry I ever allowed their fear to make me question what I felt for you. They told you about the DNA result, the hidden documents, the old letter, the recording, the person who had secretly worked behind the scenes to keep the relationship divided. And with every truth they revealed, the confusion that had surrounded your love story finally began to disappear. Then they said something you had been waiting a long time to hear. I should have defended you when they blamed you. I should have trusted what I knew in my heart. And am not letting anyone decide our future again. By the time they returned to the family home, everyone was still waiting. But the person who walked back into that room was different. They placed the DNA report, the documents, and the recording on the table. Then they looked directly at the person responsible. You told me staying away from you would protect this family. The person tried to explain. They didn't allow it. No more explanations. You were protecting a secret, not protecting me. The room fell silent. Then came the confession everyone had been avoiding. Yes, the DNA result exposed that an important biological relationship inside the family had been hidden for years. Yes, records had been concealed to protect reputation, inheritance, and decisions made by an older generation. And yes, when the relationship with you became serious, certain people became terrified that the connection between the two families would bring those records back into the light. So they interfered. They created misunderstandings. They questioned your intentions. They encouraged separation. And they hoped time would eventually make the two of you forget each other. But they underestimated one thing: the truth. And they underestimated the person standing in front of them. Because after hearing the confession, they didn't ask the family whether they were still allowed to marry you. They made the decision themselves. I love you. I want a life with you. And whatever happened before us will not decide what happens after us. Someone began crying. Another family member apologized. But the person who wants to marry you had already made their choice. They removed the old family expectations from the decision. They removed the fear. They removed the manipulation. And for the first time, they chose the future they actually wanted. You. Later that night, they came to see you carrying only two things: the DNA report that had exposed the past, and the ring that represented the future. They looked into your eyes and said, "This report told me where some of my story came from. But it doesn't get to tell me where my story ends." Then they took your hand. The family wasn't ready for this truth. Maybe neither was I. But I'm ready for one thing now. I'm ready to stop running from the person I should have fought for. And as the last secret finally lost its power, the biggest shock of all became clear. The DNA result that everyone feared would destroy the marriage had actually destroyed the lie that was keeping you apart. But even after that truth came out, there was still one final weight sitting between them. The person who wants to marry you looked down at the ring for a long moment, then admitted something they had never said aloud before. There were nights I almost convinced myself that losing you was easier than fighting everyone around me. Their eyes filled with tears. But every time I imagined my future without you, it felt like I was choosing a life that belonged to somebody else. You didn't interrupt. Because this wasn't just an apology anymore. This was someone finally understanding how deeply fear had controlled their decisions. They moved closer and said, "They gave me reasons to doubt you, but they could never give me a reason to stop loving you." Those words changed the entire moment. For so long, other voices had been louder than the truth between you. Family expectations had been louder. Secrets had been louder. Fear had been louder. But now none of those voices mattered. The next morning, another message arrived from the family. Everyone expected the person who wants to marry you to return and continue arguing. Instead, they sent one simple answer. "I know enough now. The rest of my life will not be decided inside that room." Then they turned their phone off. For the first time in years, there was no need to defend the relationship. No need to convince anyone. No need to ask permission. They simply sat beside you and started talking about the future. Not the past. Not the DNA result. Not the people who interfered. The future. Where you would live. What kind of home you wanted. What promises actually mattered. And what kind of marriage you wanted to build when nobody else was allowed to control it. Then they looked at you and smiled through tears. Maybe everything had to come into the light before I could finally understand what I was about to lose. They took your hand again. I almost let somebody else's secret become the ending of our story. Their grip tightened gently. But I won't make that mistake twice. And in that quiet moment, something finally became clear. The greatest revelation wasn't written inside the DNA report. It wasn't hidden inside the old letter. It wasn't even captured on the secret recording. The greatest revelation was the decision standing in front of you. A person who had finally stopped allowing fear to choose for them. A person who finally understood the difference between family pressure and real love. A person who had discovered that truth sometimes arrives painfully, but once it arrives, nothing built on lies can survive it. They looked directly into your eyes one last time and said, "I cannot change what they hid from us. I cannot return the time we lost. But I can choose what happens from this moment forward." Then they placed the ring in your hand. And this time, I choose you without fear. The secret had finally been exposed. The manipulation had finally ended. And the family that once believed the truth would separate you was forced to watch the exact opposite happen. Because the shocking DNA result didn't end this love story. It removed the final lie standing in its way. And after everything that tried to pull the two of you apart, the person who wants to marry you was finally certain of one thing. They were no longer fighting to discover the truth about the past. They were fighting to make sure nobody could ever steal your future again.